A rich man humiliates a black woman on a crowded plane, thinking his wealth and privilege can get him anything he wants. But when he demands she move to the back of the plane, he has no idea who's sitting behind him, and the shocking truth that will change his life forever. This isn't just a story about arrogance. It's a journey of redemption, resilience, and the hidden connections that remind us how one moment can transform everything. Who is the powerful figure who steps in? And how does this confrontation lead to a life he never expected? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The gleaming terminal of LaGuardia Airport buzzed with activity as Philip Mercer's Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor. His tall frame, wrapped in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, moved with purpose through the crowd while his free hand tightened around his designer briefcase. "Evelyn, this is completely unacceptable," he snapped into his phone, his voice sharp with irritation. "I specifically requested seat 2A. How hard is it to secure one seat?" He barely sidestepped a harried mother struggling with a rolling suitcase and a wailing toddler, not even breaking his stride as the child's cry pierced the air. "Sir, I understand, but the flight was—" Evelyn's tired voice crackled through the speaker. "No excuses," Philip cut her off. "I pay you to handle these things. Just fix it." He ended the call with an aggressive tap, muttering under his breath about competent help being impossible to find these days. Approaching the security checkpoint, Philip's lip curled at the sight of the snaking line. Without hesitation, he strode directly to the front, pulling out his Premier Access card. "Excuse me," he said, though it wasn't really a request. Several travelers shot him dirty looks, but he ignored them, focusing instead on removing his Rolex with practiced efficiency. In the premium waiting area, Philip stood near the window, maintaining a careful distance from the other passengers. He pulled out his phone again, firing off a series of demanding emails while occasionally glancing with disdain at the packed terminal beyond the glass partition. "Look at this place," he muttered to himself, watching a family with 3 children settle on the floor near their gate. "Like a barnyard." He shifted away as more passengers filtered into the premium section, his expression growing increasingly sour. An elderly gentleman with a cane approached him hesitantly. "Young man, would you mind helping me with my carry-on? My arthritis is acting up something fierce today." Philip barely spared him a glance. "There are attendants for that sort of thing," he replied dismissively, turning his shoulder and raising his phone higher like a shield. When first-class boarding was finally called, Philip was the first to stride forward, his boarding pass already extended. He moved down the jet bridge with quick steps, eager to settle into what he considered his rightful place at the front of the plane. The first-class cabin welcomed him with its familiar soft lighting and wide leather seats. He moved toward 2C, his replacement seat, only to stop short. A black woman sat in his assigned spot, her calm presence a stark contrast to his building frustration. A golden retriever wearing a service dog vest lay quietly at her feet, its gentle eyes watching Philip's approach. "Excuse me," Philip said, his tone clipped. "I believe you're in my seat." The woman looked up at him with serene composure, her simple dignity somehow making him feel smaller despite his towering stance. She pulled out her boarding pass without a word. A flight attendant appeared at Philip's elbow. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes, there's a problem," Philip said, gesturing sharply. "This is clearly a mistake." The flight attendant checked both boarding passes and shook her head. "No mistake, Mr. Mercer. Ms. Harding is in her correct seat, 2C. Your seat is 2D, right across the aisle." Philip's jaw clenched as he stared down at the woman and her dog, his carefully maintained world of privilege suddenly feeling less certain. "I'm sorry." But this is unacceptable, Philip declared loudly, his voice carrying through the first-class cabin. There must be some mistake. How can you allow a dog on board? He turned to the nearest flight attendant, expecting immediate support. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Sarah, maintained a professional smile. Sir, as I mentioned, Ms. Harding and her service animal are properly registered and have all necessary documentation. Tessa sat straight in her seat, one hand resting gently on Hope's head. Hope is a certified service dog, she explained calmly, her voice steady despite Philip's hostile tone. She assists me with my PTSD symptoms. Philip's nostrils flared. PTSD? That's convenient. And I suppose you need the dog right here in first class? He pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically. Well, this is just perfect. I happen to be allergic to dogs. You'll have to move. Sir, Tessa responded, maintaining eye contact. Hope is a medical necessity, and under the Air Carrier Access Act, she's legally permitted to accompany me. Several passengers had turned in their seats, some discreetly holding up phones to record the confrontation. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin at Philip's behavior. Medical necessity? Philip scoffed, his voice rising further. This is ridiculous. You're clearly just another person exploiting the system for special treatment. I paid good money for this seat, and I won't sit next to some dog. Another flight attendant joined Sarah, attempting to defuse the situation. Mr. Mercer, service animals are protected by federal law. We can try to find you another seat if you're uncomfortable. Find me another seat? Philip interrupted, his face reddening. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Do you know how many miles I fly? She's the one who should move. He jabbed a finger toward Tessa, who remained remarkably composed despite his outburst. Hope shifted slightly closer to Tessa's legs but maintained her calm demeanor, a sharp contrast to Philip's growing agitation. Sir, please lower your voice, Sarah requested firmly. Ms. Harding has every right to be here with her service animal. Tessa's hands trembled slightly as she stroked Hope's fur, but her voice remained steady. Mr. Mercer, I understand this isn't ideal for you, but Hope is essential for my well-being. She's highly trained and won't cause any disturbance. Philip crossed his arms, a smug expression crossing his face. We'll see about that. Get me your supervisor immediately, he demanded of the flight attendants. I refuse to accept this situation. The whispers among the other passengers grew louder, most of them clearly sympathetic to Tessa. A businessman across the aisle shook his head in disgust at Philip's behavior. Tessa's composed exterior showed the first signs of strain, her fingers curling more tightly in Hope's fur as Philip continued his tirade. But she held her ground with quiet dignity. Excuse me. A deep, authoritative voice cut through the tension. The crowd of onlookers parted as a tall, distinguished black man in a crisp navy suit stepped forward. His silver-streaked hair and commanding presence drew all eyes to him. I'm Federal Judge Martin Harding, he stated, his measured tone carrying effortlessly through the cabin. And I believe I can help clarify the legal situation here. He turned to Philip, who had frozen mid-gesture. The Air Carrier Access Act, specifically 14 CFR Part 382, protects the rights of individuals with disabilities to travel with service animals. This includes those with PTSD. Philip's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as Martin continued, addressing the entire cabin. Service dogs, like Hope, are not pets. They are highly trained medical assistants who help veterans and others managing post-traumatic stress disorder. He gestured toward Tessa, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My wife served our country with distinction, and Hope helps her navigate civilian life with dignity. The cabin erupted in support of applause. Several passengers nodded vigorously, while others shot disapproving glares at Philip. Furthermore, Martin added, his voice gentle but firm, Attempting to deny these accommodations could result in significant legal consequences for both individuals and airlines. Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped closer to Martin. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. "We appreciate your help in explaining the situation." Philip slumped in his seat, his earlier bravado deflated. The flush of embarrassment crept up his neck as he became acutely aware of the phone cameras still pointed in his direction. Tessa reached for Martin's hand, squeezing it gratefully. "Thank you," she said softly. Hope, sensing the shift in energy, laid her head gently on Tessa's lap. The golden retriever's warm presence seemed to anchor Tessa as she took several deep breaths. The plane's engines roared to life, and Philip sat in rigid silence, pointedly staring straight ahead as the aircraft began to taxi. The other passengers gradually returned to their own conversations, though occasional glances were still thrown his way. Martin settled into his seat across the aisle, maintaining a protective presence as Tessa stroked Hope's fur, finding comfort in the familiar routine. The plane shuddered slightly as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical issues that require immediate attention. As a precautionary measure, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Millbrook Regional Airport." A wave of concerned murmurs swept through the cabin. Philip immediately jabbed at his call button. "This is unacceptable," he announced loudly. "I demand to speak with someone about alternative arrangements. Do you know who I am?" Sarah, the flight attendant, approached with practiced patience. "Sir, everyone's safety is our primary concern. We'll handle all arrangements once we're safely on the ground." "I'll have my assistant arrange a private car," Philip declared, pulling out his phone despite the illuminated "No Devices" sign. "I refuse to be stranded in some backwater town." Meanwhile, Tessa remained composed, gently stroking Hope's head as the dog helped keep her calm during the descent. Martin squeezed her hand reassuringly. The landing was smooth, but the passengers' relief quickly turned to concern as they learned they'd be spending the night at the airport lodge, a modest hotel nearby. Philip's face reddened as he tried pushing past other passengers to reach the flight crew. "I need priority transport to a proper hotel," he insisted. "The Ritz Four Seasons, anything but some roadside motel." The crew members busied themselves with helping other passengers, effectively ignoring his demands. A few rows back, an elderly woman struggled with her overhead bag. Tessa stood up, Hope staying close by her side. "Let me help you with that," she offered warmly, carefully lifting down the heavy suitcase. Martin stepped up to steady the bag. "Oh, thank you, dears," the woman said gratefully. "These old arms aren't what they used to be." As passengers filed toward the exit, Philip's increasingly loud complaints about substandard accommodations and class action lawsuits drew eye rolls from fellow travelers. The contrast between his behavior and the Hardings' quiet assistance to others couldn't have been starker. 2 shuttle buses idled outside the small terminal, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Philip stood apart from the group, phone pressed to his ear as he berated his assistant about the situation. His glare followed Tessa and Martin as they chatted quietly with the elderly woman they'd helped earlier, Hope sitting attentively at Tessa's feet. The airport lodge's automatic doors wheezed open as Philip stormed into the modest lobby, his designer shoes clicking against the worn tile floor. His lip curled at the sight of faded wallpaper and dated furniture. "I need to speak with the manager immediately," he demanded, cutting in front of several other passengers waiting to check in. "This clearly isn't suitable for someone of my standing." The desk clerk, a middle-aged woman with a name tag reading Betty, maintained a professional smile. "Sir, everyone needs to wait their turn. We're doing our best to accommodate all passengers quickly." Behind him, Tessa and Martin quietly joined the line, Hope sitting perfectly still beside them. Several passengers smiled and waved at the dog, who remained focused on Tessa. When Philip finally reached the front of the line, he leaned over the counter. "I'll need your finest suite," he announced, pulling out his platinum credit card. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have suites," Betty explained. "All our rooms are standard doubles." "Impossible," Philip's voice echoed through the lobby. "There must be something better. Name your price." "Sir, this is a modest airport hotel. What you see is what we have." Philip grabbed his key card and wheeled his expensive luggage down the hallway, muttering about third-world conditions. When he opened his room door, his face fell at the sight of the basic furnishings: a double bed, a small desk, and a TV that looked at least 5 years old. Back in the lobby, he noticed Tessa and Martin chatting with a group of passengers, including the elderly couple they'd helped on the plane. Hope lay at Tessa's feet, occasionally receiving gentle pats from admiring onlookers. "The cafe here actually makes wonderful coffee," Tessa was saying warmly. "Why don't we all meet for dinner around 7? It would be nice to share a meal together." "That's so kind of you," the elderly woman responded, beaming. "We'd love to join you." Philip watched as more passengers gravitated toward the group, drawn by their genuine warmth and friendly demeanor. Even Betty, the desk clerk, joined the conversation briefly, offering menu recommendations. "This is ridiculous," Philip muttered to himself, pulling out his phone to once again try reaching his assistant. "How can they possibly be content with this?" He noticed how easily Tessa and Martin made others feel welcome, how their presence seemed to lift the mood of everyone around them. It was a stark contrast to the bubble of isolation he'd created around himself. Scowling, he retreated to his room, the sound of genuine laughter from the lobby following him down the hallway. He slammed the door shut, threw himself onto the bed, and stared at the ceiling, feeling both angry and, surprisingly, a little envious of how effortlessly the Hardings seemed to navigate this inconvenience. The hotel cafe buzzed with gentle conversation as Philip picked at his chicken Caesar salad. The lettuce was clearly from a bag and the croutons were stale. He scrolled through his phone, pretending not to notice the lively group 2 tables away. Tessa and Martin sat among several other passengers, sharing stories and passing bread rolls. Their easy laughter made Philip's solitary meal feel even more isolating. He stabbed another piece of lettuce, wondering how they could possibly be enjoying themselves in such a mediocre establishment. No, sweetie," a young mother's desperate voice cut through the dining room. Her toddler, red-faced and wailing, knocked a sippy cup to the floor. "Please, just eat something." Several diners glanced over with obvious irritation. Philip shifted in his seat, considering asking to be moved to a quieter section. Before he could wave down a server, Tessa was already on her feet. "May I?" she asked the mother softly. At the woman's tearful nod, Tessa knelt beside the high chair. "Hope, come." The golden retriever padded over, tail wagging gently. The toddler's cries hitched as Hope sat perfectly still, her warm brown eyes fixed on the child. Tessa guided the little one's hand to Hope's soft fur. "This is my friend Hope. She's very gentle, see?" The crying stopped completely as the toddler patted Hope's head. A wobbly smile appeared, followed by a delighted giggle when Hope gave a tiny lick to the child's palm. "Oh my God, thank you," the mother whispered, wiping her eyes. "We've been traveling all day and I couldn't." "We've all been there," Tessa assured her, squeezing her hand. "Would you like to join us? We have plenty of room." Philip watched as the mother gathered her things, accepting help from Martin, to move her bags to their table. The toddler kept one hand firmly on Hope's fur as they walked, still sniffling, but calm. The scene stirred something uncomfortable in Philip's chest. He looked down at his phone, but instead of stock prices and emails, he saw his own reflection in the dark screen. The image seemed suddenly unfamiliar. A man dining alone, while others found connection and comfort just feet away. Pushing back his chair with more force than necessary, Philip stood and strode toward the exit. He couldn't quite name the feeling that made his chest tight and his steps quick, but he knew he didn't want to examine it too closely. Sleep, he decided. That's all he needed. Tomorrow he'd be back in his perfectly ordered world, where things made sense. Philip paced his small hotel room, his designer shoes wearing a path in the thin carpet. His phone buzzed for the third time that morning. Evelyn again. With a frustrated sigh, he answered. "What now?" "Mr. Mercer, we need to discuss what happened on that flight." Evelyn's voice was tense. "Do you realize who Judge Martin Harding is? He's not just any federal judge. He's known for his civil rights advocacy and has a massive following on social media." Philip rolled his eyes. "It was hardly a scene, Evelyn. Just a minor disagreement about seating arrangements." "That's not what I'm hearing," she countered. "Several passengers were recording the incident. If any of those videos surface showing you arguing with a disabled veteran and her service dog, while her federal judge husband had to intervene..." She let the implications hang in the air. "Please," Philip scoffed, though his stomach tightened. "People are too sensitive these days. I had legitimate concerns about sitting next to a dog." "A service dog, Mr. Mercer, protected by federal law, the same laws Judge Harding helps enforce." Evelyn's voice grew firmer. "We need to get ahead of this. I suggest drafting a public apology." "Absolutely not," Philip snapped. "I'm not apologizing for expecting basic comfort standards on a flight I paid good money for." "The internet won't see it that way," Evelyn warned. "One viral video of you berating a veteran..." "Enough!" Philip pulled up his browser, quickly searching his name and airport incident. Nothing yet. "There's nothing online. You're overreacting." "For now," Evelyn said, "but it only takes one post." Philip walked to the window, pushing aside the cheap curtains. In the courtyard below, he spotted Tessa and Martin surrounded by other passengers. They were smiling, sharing coffee and conversation like old friends. His jaw clenched at the sight. "I have to go," he cut Evelyn off mid-sentence. "Just handle it if anything comes up. That's what I pay you for." He ended the call before she could respond, tossing his phone onto the bed. They couldn't touch him. He had the best PR team money could buy. Still, he turned away from the window, unable to watch the scene below any longer. The hotel's dining area buzzed with quiet conversation as Philip nursed his third cup of coffee. He'd chosen the corner table deliberately, keeping his back to the wall and his eyes on his phone. But despite his attempts to focus on work emails, Tessa's voice kept drawing his attention. "I never expected to need hope," Tessa was saying to the small group gathered around her table. "When I came home from my last deployment, I thought I could handle everything on my own." Philip glanced up, watching as she absently stroked Hope's golden fur. The dog sat perfectly still beside her chair, alert but calm. "The nightmares were the worst," Tessa continued, her voice steady but soft. "I'd wake up in cold sweats thinking I was back there, back in that moment when our convoy hit the AD. Several passengers leaned forward, their breakfast forgotten. An elderly woman reached out and patted Tessa's hand. "3 of my team didn't make it," Tessa shared, her composure wavering slightly. "I survived, but the guilt, the anxiety, it followed me home." Martin, sitting beside her, gently squeezed her shoulder. "That's when we learned about service dogs for veterans with PTSD," he added. "Hope came into our lives about 2 years ago." Tessa smiled down at the golden retriever. "She knows when I'm starting to spiral before I do. She'll nudge my hand or lay her head in my lap. Sometimes just her presence helps ground me in the present." "It's remarkable," Martin continued, "how hope not only helps Tessa, but creates bridges with others who are struggling. We've seen her calm children having meltdowns, comfort grieving seniors. Philip set his phone down, no longer pretending to read emails. He watched as Tessa demonstrated how hope would gently press against her legs when sensing anxiety, or how the dog would create space between Tessa and crowds when things got overwhelming. The other passengers asked questions, their faces showing genuine interest and empathy. A young man mentioned his brother who had served, and Tessa listened intently, offering quiet words of understanding. Philip finished his coffee in silence, his earlier certainty about Tessa using her dog for special treatment beginning to crack. He stood abruptly, gathering his things to leave, but found himself lingering just long enough to hear Tessa's final words. "Hope reminds me every day that healing isn't just about surviving," she said, scratching behind her dog's ears. "It's about learning to live again, to connect with others, to find purpose in the pain." Without acknowledging anyone, Philip left the dining area, Tessa's words echoing in his mind despite his efforts to dismiss them. The hotel's small lounge area felt even more cramped as passengers gathered, sharing stories of missed connections and delayed plans. Philip stood at the edge of the group, coffee cup in hand, feeling oddly compelled to join, despite his discomfort. He carefully positioned himself away from Tessa and Martin, who sat near the window with Hope at their feet. "It's amazing how one small mechanical issue can affect so many lives," an elderly man remarked, shaking his head. "Sometimes the smallest things have the biggest impact," Martin responded, his deep voice carrying across the room. "I see it every day in my courtroom, how one decision can ripple through an entire community." Philip stiffened as Martin continued. "Just last month, I presided over a case involving dozens of families forced out of their homes. The developer had bought up their apartment complex, promising to help them relocate. Instead, they were given 30 days to leave, many ending up homeless." The room grew quiet. Philip's coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand. He recognized the case. It was his company's development on Oak Street. "But business isn't personal," Philip interjected, his voice sharper than intended. "Cities need to grow. Progress requires tough decisions." Martin turned to face him directly. "Tough decisions? Like evicting single mothers in winter? Like forcing elderly residents to leave homes they've lived in for decades?" Other passengers murmured in agreement with Martin. A woman near Philip shifted away slightly. "Those people received fair market value," Philip argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "Fair market value doesn't account for community," Martin replied calmly. "It doesn't measure the cost of children changing schools mid-year or seniors losing their support networks. It doesn't calculate the human toll." Tessa remained silent, but her steady gaze made Philip increasingly uncomfortable. Hope watched him too, her brown eyes seeming to pierce right through him. "We had permits," Philip said weakly. "Everything was legal." "Legal doesn't always mean right," Martin responded. "And decisions that seem purely business to some can destroy lives for others." The other passengers nodded, several casting disapproving looks at Philip. He felt sweat forming on his forehead as the weight of their judgment pressed in on him. "If you'll excuse me," Philip muttered, setting down his untouched coffee. He hurried from the lounge, Martin's words following him like unwanted shadows. The hotel lobby buzzed with restless energy as passengers waited for news about their delayed flight. Children whined, adults checked their phones, and the front desk clerk repeatedly assured everyone she had no updates yet. Philip leaned against a wall, arms crossed, watching Tessa and Hope interact with a young girl who seemed fascinated by the service dog. A sudden commotion near the front desk drew everyone's attention. An elderly man clutched his chest, stumbling forward before crumpling to the floor. Gasps and screams filled the air as passengers backed away, creating a circle around his fallen form. "Everyone, step back!" Tessa's voice cut through the chaos as she moved swiftly to the man's side. Hope stayed perfectly in step with her, maintaining a calm presence amid the panic. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered as he tried to respond. Tessa knelt beside him, her movements precise and practiced. She checked his pulse, then positioned him on his side in the recovery position. "Martin, call 911, she commanded, her voice steady. "Let them know we have a possible cardiac event." Hope settled next to the elderly man's head, her warm presence seeming to comfort him as he reached out weakly to touch her fur. Tessa continued her assessment, speaking softly to the man while checking his vital signs. Philip watched, transfixed, as Tessa worked. Her hands moved with confidence. Her voice remained calm and reassuring. This wasn't the woman he dismissed on the plane. This was someone else entirely. Someone capable, strong, and deeply compassionate. "The ambulance is 3 minutes out," Martin announced, managing the growing crowd of onlookers. "Please give them space, everyone. Step back." Several passengers had their phones out, recording the scene. The elderly man's breathing seemed to steady as Tessa kept talking to him, one hand on his shoulder while Hope maintained her vigilant position. "You're doing great, sir," Tessa assured him. "Help is almost here. Just keep focusing on your breathing. Hope here isn't going anywhere." Philip felt something shift inside him as he watched her work. The entitled woman he'd imagined her to be dissolved completely, replaced by someone he barely recognized, someone whose strength he couldn't deny. His cheeks burned as he remembered his behavior on the plane, his baseless accusations about her service dog. The sound of sirens grew closer, and soon EMTs burst through the hotel doors with their equipment. They took over from Tessa, who backed away smoothly, but kept Hope nearby until they had the situation fully under control. As the medical team wheeled the man out on a stretcher, spontaneous applause broke out in the lobby. Tessa accepted it with a modest nod, her hand resting on Hope's head. Philip found himself clapping too, though the gesture felt inadequate against the weight of his earlier judgment. The hotel lounge had emptied as evening settled in, leaving only a few scattered passengers nursing drinks or reading books. Philip sat alone in a corner armchair, scrolling through emails on his phone, when a shadow fell across his screen. "Mr. Mercer," Martin's deep voice commanded his attention. "May I join you?" Philip gestured stiffly to the empty chair beside him. "Judge Harding?" Martin settled into the chair, his expression grave. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your business practices." "With all due respect," Philip began, but Martin held up a hand. "Do you remember the Riverside Commons project from last year?" Martin's tone was measured but firm. "The one where you demolished an entire apartment complex to build luxury condos?" Philip shifted uncomfortably. "That was a completely legal transaction. The market demanded—" "Sarah Johnson lived there," Martin cut in. "Tessa's best friend from her military days. A single mother with 2 children who'd finally found stable housing after years of struggle." The name meant nothing to Philip, but the weight in Martin's voice made his stomach twist. "Sarah ended up in a shelter," Martin continued. "Her kids had to change schools mid-year. The trauma of displacement triggered her depression. She lost her job because she couldn't maintain a reliable address for employers." "I didn't—" Philip swallowed hard. "The residents were given notice. There were relocation packages. Packages that didn't come close to covering the real cost of moving in this market." Martin's voice hardened. "You can't put a price tag on community, Mr. Mercer. On stability. On children's sense of security." Philip stared at his hands, remembering how he'd dismissed the resident protests as mere inconveniences. He'd never bothered to learn their names or stories. I was following standard business practices, he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Real leadership, Martin leaned forward, requires more than following the market. It demands understanding the human cost of our decisions. Sarah was a decorated veteran who served alongside Tessa. She deserved better than being treated like a statistic on a spreadsheet. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Philip could feel the weight of Martin's words pressing down on him, forcing him to confront the reality of his choices. You can make different choices moving forward, Martin said quietly. But first, you need to acknowledge the harm you've caused. Philip rose abruptly, unable to meet Martin's gaze. As he hurried toward the elevator, he passed Tessa in the hallway. The sight of her made his chest tighten with shame, and he quickened his pace, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor until he reached the safety of his room. The hotel lounge was nearly deserted, its dim lighting casting long shadows across the empty tables. Philip sat hunched in a corner booth, his untouched whiskey growing warm as he stared at his phone, without really seeing it. Martin's words from earlier echoed in his mind, each revelation feeling like another weight added to his shoulders. The soft clicking of nails on tile made him look up. Tessa entered with Hope padding quietly beside her. She paused when she saw him, then straightened her shoulders and approached his table. "Mind if we join you?" she asked softly. Philip gestured wordlessly to the empty seat across from him. Hope settled beside Tessa, her gentle brown eyes watching Philip with what seemed like understanding. "Couldn't sleep?" Tessa asked, breaking the awkward silence. "Too much on my mind," Philip admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Tessa nodded. "I know that feeling. Before Hope, I used to spend countless nights just thinking, replaying moments I wished I could change." "How did you—" Philip started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "How did I move forward?" Tessa finished for him. She reached down to scratch behind Hope's ears. "It wasn't easy. After my third tour, I was lost. The memories, the guilt, the fear, they consumed me. I pushed everyone away, convinced I was broken beyond repair." Hope shifted, laying her head on Philip's lap. He froze, then slowly placed his hand on her soft fur. "I've spent my whole life building things," Philip said quietly. "Buildings, developments, wealth. I never stopped to think about what I might be destroying in the process." "Recognition is the first step," Tessa replied. "We all have chapters in our story we wish we could rewrite." Philip felt something warm and wet on his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, hoping Tessa hadn't noticed. "I don't know if I can fix what I've broken." "It's never too late to choose a different path," Tessa said, standing up. Hope lifted her head from Philip's lap and moved to her side. They walked away, leaving Philip alone with his thoughts and the lingering warmth where Hope had rested. The morning sun filtered through the hotel lobby's windows, casting long shadows across the gathered passengers. The air hummed with quiet conversations and the clink of coffee cups as people waited for news about their delayed flight. Philip stood at the entrance, his hands clammy and his throat dry, as he observed Tessa and Martin sitting among the others. Hope curled contentedly at their feet. Taking a deep breath, Philip stepped forward. His expensive shoes clicked against the tile floor as he made his way to the center of the room. With each step, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I'd like to say something, if I may." The conversations died down. Tessa looked up, her expression neutral but attentive. Martin sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "I owe all of you, especially Mrs. Harding, an apology," Philip continued, his voice growing steadier. "My behavior on the plane was inexcusable. I was disrespectful, entitled, and completely wrong." He turned directly to Tessa. You showed nothing but grace and dignity while I acted like a fool. And then yesterday, when that man needed help, you didn't hesitate. You just acted. It made me realize how small my own problems were." The lobby remained silent. A few passengers nodded encouragingly. "I've spent most of my life thinking my wealth and status made me better than others," Philip admitted. "But being stranded here has shown me how wrong I was. Mrs. Harding, your composure and kindness, despite my behavior, has taught me more in 2 days than I've learned in years." Tessa stood slowly, hope rising with her. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer," she said clearly. "But apologies are just words unless they're followed by action. Real change requires commitment." "I understand," Philip replied, nodding solemnly. A smattering of applause broke out among the passengers. Martin's stern expression softened slightly as he offered Philip a small, approving smile. Philip returned to his seat, his face flushed, but his shoulders lighter. For the first time in his life, he felt the unfamiliar sensation of true humility, and with it, the first glimpse of a different path forward. The afternoon sun warmed the hotel's courtyard as Philip spotted Tessa throwing a tennis ball for Hope. The golden retriever bounded after it with enthusiasm, her tail wagging joyfully. Philip hesitated at the entrance, gathering his courage before approaching. "Mrs. Harding?" he called softly. "Do you have a moment?" Tessa turned, catching the tennis ball Hope had brought back. "Of course, Mr. Mercer." "I've been thinking about my apology," Philip said, shifting his weight. "Words are easy. I want to do something meaningful, something that actually helps people like yourself. I don't know where to start." Tessa studied him for a moment, then gestured to a nearby bench. As they sat, Hope settled at their feet, her warm presence oddly comforting to Philip. "The biggest challenge for many veterans with PTSD is finding stable housing," Tessa began. "Landlords often discriminate against service dogs, even though it's illegal, and many veterans struggle with finances after serving." Philip pulled out his phone, opening the Notes app. "What other barriers do veterans face?" "Some apartment complexes won't accept VA housing vouchers," Tessa explained. "Others require income levels that are impossible for disabled veterans. And finding pet-friendly housing that's also affordable? That's even harder." "I never considered these issues," Philip admitted, typing quickly. "How did you manage?" "I was lucky," Tessa said, reaching down to scratch Hope's ears. "But my friend Sarah, the one Martin told you about, she wasn't. When your company bought her building, she couldn't find another place that would accept her service dog. She ended up living in her car for 3 months." Philip's fingers froze over his phone. I had no idea." "Most developers don't," Tessa said gently. "But you have the power to change things. Your resources, your connections, they could create safe spaces for veterans to heal." Philip's mind raced with possibilities. What if we develop property specifically designed for veterans, with built-in support services, accommodations for service animals? "That could change lives," Tessa nodded. "Many veterans just need a chance to rebuild. A stable home makes everything else possible." Hope nudged Philip's hand with her nose, and he found himself automatically petting her. "Could you tell me more about how service dogs help? I want to understand everything." As Tessa began explaining, Philip filled page after page with notes, his real estate developer's mind already transforming her insights into concrete plans. The soft clink of coffee cups and quiet chatter filled the hotel cafe as Philip sat alone, reviewing emails on his phone. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm patches across the polished wooden tables. A familiar voice caught his attention from 2 tables over. "You have to finish that memoir, Tessa," a man in his 50s was saying, his weathered face earnest beneath salt and pepper hair. Your story needs to be told." Philip glanced up, noticing Tessa's uncomfortable shift in her chair. Hope lay vigilantly at her feet, sensing her unease, her tail twitching slightly as she monitored her owner's emotions. "I don't know, Dave," Tessa replied, stirring her tea absently, the spoon making tiny circles in the amber liquid. "Writing about those experiences, it brings everything back." "That's exactly why it matters," Dave insisted, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who truly understood. "When I came home, I felt so alone, like nobody could understand what I was going through. Reading other veterans' stories saved my life." Tessa's hands tightened around her cup, her knuckles whitening with the pressure. "The chapter about the ambush, I've rewritten it 12 times. Every time I try to describe what happened, how it felt when we lost Johnson." "And that's the raw truth others need to hear," Dave said gently, his voice carrying years of shared understanding. "The nightmares, the flashbacks, how hope helped you find your way back. It could give someone else hope." Philip watched as Tessa reached down to stroke Hope's fur, drawing strength from her companion's presence. The service dog pressed closer against her leg, offering silent support. "I've got about 3/4 written," she admitted, a hint of pride mixing with frustration in her voice. "But publishers say stories about female veterans don't sell well. They want me to focus more on the dramatic moments, less on the healing journey." "That's ridiculous," Dave scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. "The healing journey is the whole point." "Exactly," Tessa agreed, straightening in her chair. "I want to show others that PTSD isn't the end of the story. That, with the right support, the right companions—" She smiled down at Hope, who gazed back with devoted brown eyes. "We can rebuild ourselves." Philip's fingers hovered over his phone, his mind already racing through his publishing industry contacts. He'd never considered using his connections this way before, but hearing the quiet determination in Tessa's voice stirred something in him. The familiar drive to succeed sparked within him, but for once, it wasn't about profit. "What about self-publishing?" Dave suggested, drumming his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "The costs are overwhelming," Tessa sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "And marketing. I wouldn't even know where to start." Philip made a mental note, remembering his college friend who'd started a successful publishing house specializing in military stories. He kept his eyes on his phone, but his attention remained fixed on their conversation, absorbing every detail about Tessa's project and the obstacles she faced. For the first time in years, he felt an opportunity to use his connections for something truly meaningful. Philip stood at the head of the conference table, his usual power stance replaced by something more thoughtful. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown office, illuminating the confused faces of his executive team. "I know this is unexpected," he began, his voice firm but gentler than usual. "But Hope's Haven isn't just another development project. It's about making things right." Evelyn Parker, seated to his right, studied the preliminary sketches with raised eyebrows. "Veterans housing? This is different for us, Philip." "Exactly." He tapped the rendering of a modern apartment complex. "We're talking fully accessible units, dedicated spaces for service animals, and on-site support services. The community center will offer counseling, job training, and social spaces." Marcus Chen, his head of finance, frowned at the numbers. "The profit margins on this are practically non-existent. Our shareholders—" "Will understand that not everything is about maximizing profits," Philip interrupted, surprising himself with his own conviction. "Look, I've spent years displacing communities, choosing profit over people. This project is about creating homes, not just housing." The room fell silent. Philip clicked to the next slide, showing a peaceful courtyard design. Each building will have dedicated green spaces for service animals, The entire complex will be designed with PTSD triggers in mind. Sound dampening, clear sight lines, multiple exit routes. "But the land costs alone," Marcus began. "We'll use the Wilson Street property," Philip declared. Several executives gasped. The Wilson Street development was supposed to be their next luxury condo project. "That's prime real estate," Evelyn said carefully. "Are you sure about this?" Philip nodded, remembering Tessa's quiet dignity. "It's perfect. Close to the VA hospital. Good public transport links. We'll work with veterans organizations to ensure we're meeting real needs, not just what we think they need." The team exchanged uncertain glances, but Philip noticed Evelyn starting to nod slowly. "I can start reaching out to veterans advocacy groups," she offered. "Get their input on the design requirements." "Good," Philip said. "This isn't just about building apartments. It's about creating a community where veterans can heal and thrive, where people like Tessa can find not just shelter, but home." Philip sat at his desk, staring at the stack of project files before him. Each folder represented a development that would have displaced families or destroyed communities. With steady hands, he began sorting them into two piles: projects to cancel and those that could be modified to benefit local residents. "Are you sure about this?" Evelyn asked, watching him work. "The Brighton Heights development alone was projected to bring in millions." "I'm sure," Philip replied, his voice firm. "I've spent years building walls between people. It's time to break them down instead." He picked up his phone, thumb hovering over Andrew's number. The last time they'd spoken, 3 years ago, Andrew had called him a heartless corporate vulture. Philip couldn't blame him. He'd been right. The coffee shop was quiet when Philip arrived. Andrew was already there, sitting stiffly in a corner booth. His younger brother's face showed the same stubborn set of their father's jaw, but his eyes held a wariness that made Philip's chest ache. "Thanks for coming," Philip said, sliding into the seat across from him. Andrew nodded curtly. "You said it was important." Philip wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, drawing strength from its warmth. "I owe you an apology. Several, actually. You were right about everything. The developments, the displacements, all of it. I was wrong." Andrew's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent. I met someone who helped me see things differently. A veteran named Tessa and her service dog, Hope. They showed me what real strength looks like." Philip pulled out the preliminary sketches for Hope's Haven. "I'm changing direction. This is my new project. Affordable housing for veterans with full support services." Andrew leaned forward despite himself, studying the plans. "This is different." "I know it won't make up for everything," Philip continued, "but I want to do better, be better, and I miss my brother." Andrew was quiet for a long moment. "It's going to take more than one conversation to fix things, Phil." "I know," Philip nodded, "but I'm willing to put in the work, if you are." "We'll see," Andrew said, but the ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Tell me more about this Haven project." Philip's hands tightened nervously on the steering wheel as he pulled into the Hardings' driveway. In the passenger seat, Grace, a gentle brown mixed-breed dog, wagged her tail eagerly. Her warm eyes reminded him of Hope's calming presence that day on the plane. "Well, girl, this is it," he murmured, reaching over to scratch behind her ears. Tessa opened the door before he could knock, Hope at her side. Her face lit up when she saw Grace. "Philip, who's this beautiful girl?" "This is Grace," Philip said, his voice thick with emotion. "I adopted her last week from the local shelter. After everything that happened, well, she reminded me of Hope and of how much I've learned from both of you." Martin appeared behind Tessa, smiling warmly. "Come in, both of you." Inside, over cups of steaming coffee, Philip spread out the latest plans for Hope's Haven across the Hardings' kitchen table. "The first phase of construction starts next month," he explained, pointing to the detailed blueprints. "We've already received applications from 20 veterans." "This is remarkable," Martin said, studying the plans. "You know, I have connections with several veterans advocacy groups. I'd be happy to help spread the word." Tessa watched as Hope and Grace played together in the corner, already fast friends. "When you first sat next to us on that plane," she said softly, "I never would have imagined we'd be here now." "Neither would I," Philip admitted. "I was so caught up in my own importance, I couldn't see past myself. You both showed me a different way to live." "The fact that you were willing to change," Tessa replied, "that gives me hope for others who might be trapped in the same mindset you were." The evening passed with easy conversation and shared laughter. For the first time in years, Philip felt truly connected to others, part of something bigger than himself or his business empire. As Grace curled up contentedly beside Hope, Philip realized he'd found more than just inspiration in the Hardings. He'd found friendship, purpose, and a chance at redemption. Philip's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, its crisp white paper bearing a handwritten address in neat, careful strokes. Inside, he found a letter from the Martinez family, a veteran couple with 2 young children who would be among the first residents of Hope's Haven. The paper held a faint scent of lavender, as if it had been written at a kitchen table with a vase of flowers nearby. "Dear Mr. Mercer," the letter began, "words cannot express our gratitude. For the past 3 years, we've been living in my parents' basement, struggling to find affordable housing that would accommodate my wife Sarah's service dog and my wheelchair. The constant rejection has taken its toll on all of us." Philip had to pause, taking a deep breath as emotion welled up in his chest. His fingers brushed against the slightly wrinkled paper, where tears had clearly fallen as the letter was being written. He remembered Tessa's words about the impact of stable housing on veterans' recovery. The letter continued, describing the family's challenges: wait lists for accessible apartments, landlords who refuse to accept service animals, and the strain of living paycheck to paycheck while medical bills mounted. "When we received the news about being selected for Hope's Haven, our 8-year-old daughter Emma cried with joy. For the first time, she'll have her own room. Our son Miguel will be able to invite friends over without feeling ashamed. But most importantly, Sarah and I will finally have a place that feels like home, a place designed to help us heal. The thought of wide doorways and smooth floors means I won't have to struggle just to move around anymore." Tears blurred Philip's vision as he reached the final paragraphs. The family described their plans for the future: Sarah's goal to finish her degree in social work, their children's excitement about the community garden and the accessible playground, their relief at finding a place that truly understood their needs and welcomed their service dog without question. Philip pulled out his monogrammed stationery, determined to write a personal response. His pen hovered over the paper as he considered his words carefully, wanting to convey both professionalism and genuine warmth. "Dear Martinez family," he wrote, "your letter has touched me deeply. Your story reminds me why Hope's Haven matters so much. Would you consider sharing your experience at our ribbon-cutting ceremony? Your voice could help others understand the importance of accessible, veteran-focused housing. Your family's journey represents exactly what we hope to achieve." As he finished the letter, Philip glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a picture from last week's site visit showing him with Tessa, Martin, and several veteran families. Hope sat perfectly posed beside Tessa, her presence a reminder of why the project included dedicated pet areas. The construction site behind them was already taking shape, transforming from bare earth into something meaningful, with the foundation laid and walls beginning to rise. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it into an envelope. The Martinez family's words echoed in his mind. "You've given us more than just a home. You've given us hope for the future. Our children finally believe in possibilities again." Looking out his office window at the city skyline, Philip felt a profound sense of purpose. This was what real success felt like, not the cold satisfaction of closing a profitable deal, but the warm knowledge that he was genuinely helping others build new lives. The glass towers that had once represented his achievements now seemed to shine with a different kind of promise. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cafe's windows, casting a warm glow over the trio seated at a corner table. Tessa's hands wrapped tightly around her tea mug as she processed Philip's news. "A publisher? Really?" Her voice wavered slightly. Hope lay quietly at her feet, sensing her nervousness. Philip nodded, his expression gentle. "They're very interested in your story, Tessa. They believe it could help countless veterans struggling with PTSD." Martin reached over and squeezed his wife's hand. "You've always wanted to reach more people, honey. This could be your chance." Tessa took a shaky breath. But sharing everything, the nightmares, the panic attacks, the darkest moments, it's different than talking to someone face to face. "That's exactly why it matters," Philip said softly. "When I met you on that plane, I was so wrapped up in my own world. But your strength, your dignity, it changed something in me. Your story has power, Tessa." "He's right," Martin added. "Remember how many veterans approached you after your speaking engagement last month? They needed to hear they weren't alone." Tessa absently stroked Hope's fur. "What if people don't understand? What if they think I'm weak for struggling?" "Being vulnerable isn't weakness," Philip replied. "It's courage. And anyone who reads your story will see that." "The truth is," Martin said, "your vulnerability is what makes your story real. It's what will help others feel seen and understood." Tessa looked between the two men, her husband who'd supported her through everything, and Philip, whose transformation proved the impact one person's story could have. She straightened her shoulders, decision crystallizing. "You're right," she said. "If sharing my journey helps even one person feel less alone, it's worth it." Philip smiled warmly. "The publisher would like to meet next week. They're excited about the project." "Thank you, Philip," Tessa said, extending her hand across the table, "for believing in me." Philip shook her hand firmly, then gathered his coat and briefcase. As he walked out of the cafe, Tessa watched him go, feeling a surge of determination. Hope nuzzled her hand, and she smiled, ready to take this next step in her journey. The grand ballroom sparkled with elegant chandeliers, but unlike Philip's previous galas, the atmosphere felt warmer, more purposeful. Veterans in dress uniforms mingled with business executives, while Hope sat regally beside Tessa, wearing a special vest decorated for the occasion. Philip adjusted his tie nervously as he watched Tessa approach the podium. She wore a simple navy dress, her hands clasped tightly together as she faced the crowd. Martin gave her an encouraging nod from the front row. "When I returned from deployment," Tessa began, her voice steady despite her obvious nerves, "I felt lost in my own country. The simplest tasks, grocery shopping, riding the subway, became overwhelming challenges." She paused, reaching down to stroke Hope's head. "Then this beautiful soul came into my life, and slowly I found my way back." The audience sat in rapt attention as Tessa described her journey. Several people dabbed at their eyes when she spoke about the veterans who struggled to find stable housing, making their recovery even more difficult. "That's why Hope's Haven isn't just about buildings," she continued. "It's about creating a community where healing can happen." Philip stepped up next, his usual corporate polish replaced by genuine emotion. "A few months ago, I was a different person," he admitted. Meeting Tessa and Martin showed me what true strength and dignity look like. They taught me that success isn't measured by profit margins, but by the lives we touch. Throughout the evening, veterans approached Philip to share their stories. Each conversation reinforced his commitment to the project. He watched as Martin skillfully engaged with potential donors, explaining the long-term vision for expanding Hope's Haven. The pledges exceeded expectations, with several donors offering not just money, but resources and connections. Philip felt a profound sense of fulfillment, so different from the hollow satisfaction of his previous business victories. Later, on the venue's balcony, Tessa found Philip gazing at the city lights. Hope padded quietly beside her. "Thank you for doing this," she said softly, "for using your influence to make real change." "I should be thanking you," Philip replied. "You and Martin showed me a better path when I needed it most." James Harrington's accusations splashed across the business section headlines. "Mercer's makeover, real change, or PR ploy?" The words stung, but Philip forced himself to read every article. At his desk, he scrolled through social media posts questioning his motives, his hand tensing around his coffee mug. "Mr. Mercer," Evelyn said, entering his office with a concerned look, "Channel 7 wants a response to Mr. Harrington's statements." Philip set down his mug and took a deep breath. "Schedule a press conference. It's time to face this head on." The next morning, Philip stood before a sea of reporters. Camera flashes punctuated the tense atmosphere as he gripped the podium. "I won't deny my past actions," Philip began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "For years, I prioritized profits over people. I displaced families and destroyed communities. Those aren't accusations. They're facts, and I'm not here to ask anyone to forget that." The reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Philip continued, "What I am doing now isn't about erasing my past. It's about taking responsibility for it. Hope's Haven isn't a PR stunt. It's the beginning of making amends." Later that afternoon, Tessa appeared on the local news. She sat poised in the studio, Hope at her feet. "I met Philip Mercer at his worst," she said candidly. "I watched his transformation firsthand. This isn't about image rehabilitation. I've seen him cancel profitable projects to prioritize veteran housing. He's learning, growing, and most importantly, he's doing the work." The media storm continued, but Philip focused on his commitments. He reviewed construction plans, met with veteran groups, and expanded the project's scope. Still, Harrington's words echoed in his mind. "Once a vulture, always a vulture." "Your past doesn't define you," Martin reminded him during a project meeting. "Your actions now do." That evening, Philip found an email from a veteran who'd recently moved into Hope's Haven. "My kids have their own rooms for the first time," it read. "We feel safe here. Whatever anyone says about you, Mr. Mercer, you've changed our lives." Philip printed the email, his hand steady as he pinned it to his office wall. The criticism still hurt, but he understood now. Redemption wasn't about public perception. It was about the lives he could help change, one family at a time. Philip's hands trembled slightly as he approached the modest diner where he'd arranged to meet the Martinez family. Through the window, he could see them. Maria Martinez, her husband Carlos, and their teenage daughter, Sofia. They were one of many families his company had displaced 5 years ago when developing luxury condos in their working-class neighborhood. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. The family looked up, their expressions guarded. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line as she recognized him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Philip said softly, sliding into the booth across from them. Carlos nodded stiffly. "We were surprised to get your call." Sofia, who had been 12 when they lost their home, stared at him with undisguised hurt. "Why now?" she asked. "Why do you want to talk to us after all this time?" Philip took a deep breath. "Because I need to face what I did, the pain I caused, and because I want to make things right, even though I know I can never fully undo the damage." Maria's eyes glistened as she described the months after their eviction, staying with relatives, Carlos working double shifts, Sophia having to change schools. "We lost our community," she said. "Our neighbors, our support system, everything we'd built over 15 years. Philip listened without interrupting, his throat tight. Each detail was like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the human cost of his ruthless business decisions. "When we heard about Hope's Haven," Carlos added, "we were skeptical. People like you don't change." "I understand your doubt," Philip replied. "I was that person, focused only on profit, viewing people as obstacles rather than human beings. Meeting Tessa and seeing her work with veterans opened my eyes. But that doesn't excuse what I did to your family and so many others." He pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "I'd like to offer your family priority placement in the next Hope's Haven development. It's not charity, it's an attempt at restitution. And if you're willing, I'd like you to share your story at the opening ceremony. People need to understand both sides, the harm that was done and the possibility of change." Sophia looked at her parents uncertainly. Maria reached across the table and touched Philip's hand, a gesture of such unexpected grace that he had to blink back tears. "We will consider it," she said quietly. "Not because we've forgotten, but because maybe your change can inspire others to do better." Philip nodded, humbled by their willingness to even consider his offer. "Thank you," he managed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," Carlos interrupted firmly. "You don't. But maybe you can earn our trust through your actions going forward." The autumn sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Philip stood before the gathered crowd. Construction equipment loomed behind him, ready to break ground on the first Hope's Haven complex. The familiar weight of his prepared speech felt heavy in his pocket, but he decided to speak from his heart instead. "A few months ago, I was a different person," Philip began, his voice carrying across the attentive audience. "I was someone who valued profit over people, someone who couldn't see beyond my own privilege." He glanced at Tessa and Martin in the front row, drawing strength from their encouraging smiles. "It took an unexpected delay, a service dog named Hope, and two remarkable individuals to show me what truly matters." Philip gestured to the Hardings. "This project isn't just about building homes. It's about creating community, offering dignity, and showing our veterans that their service matters." Tessa stepped forward, Hope padding faithfully beside her. Together, they approached the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the construction entrance. Camera flashes erupted as Philip handed Tessa the oversized scissors. "Would you do the honors?" he asked softly. "None of this would exist without you." Tessa's hand steadied as she gripped the scissors. "This is for every veteran who struggled to find their place," she said, her voice clear and strong. The ribbon fell away to enthusiastic applause. Local news crews captured the moment as Philip led Tessa and Martin on a tour of the site. He pointed out where the therapy rooms would be, the specially designed areas for service animals, and the community spaces that would bring residents together. "We're already planning 2 more complexes," Philip explained to a reporter. "This isn't a one-time project. It's a commitment to our veterans and our community." A veteran in a wheelchair approached Philip, tears in his eyes. "My wife and I have been on housing wait lists for years," he said. This changes everything." Philip felt a lump in his throat as he watched the construction equipment roar to life. The first scoop of earth marked the beginning of something profound, not just for the future residents, but for himself. Standing there, surrounded by people who believed in his vision, he felt a deep sense of purpose that no amount of wealth had ever provided. Philip stood in his kitchen, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron for the 10th time that evening. The cookbook lay open on the marble counter, its pages marked with colorful sticky notes and smudged with nervous fingerprints. The rich aroma of roasting chicken and fresh herbs filled the air, and he checked the temperature again with shaking hands, determined not to mess up this important dinner. "Just follow the recipe," he muttered to himself, chopping fresh rosemary and thyme with careful precision. One step at a time. His usual confidence in the boardroom, where million-dollar deals came naturally, felt worlds away from this unfamiliar domestic scene. The doorbell chimed, and Philip's heart jumped into his throat. He smoothed down his casual blue shirt, no power suits or silk ties tonight, and walked quickly to the door. Tessa and Martin stood there, warm smiles lighting up their faces. Tessa's arms cradled a carefully wrapped package tied with a simple ribbon. "Something smells wonderful," Tessa said, stepping inside and breathing in deeply. She glanced around his minimalist living room with interest, taking in the clean lines and modern artwork. "I hope you like chicken," Philip replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness as he led them to the dining room where he'd meticulously set the table with his best china and silverware. "I've never actually cooked for guests before. Usually I just order in." Martin chuckled warmly. "There's a first time for everything. We're honored to be your guinea pigs." They settled into their seats, and Tessa presented their gift with a gentle smile. "We thought you might like this." Philip carefully unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully framed photograph of Hope at the groundbreaking ceremony. Her golden fur gleaming in the sunlight as she sat proudly beside the ceremonial shovel, her eyes bright and alert. "This is..." Philip's voice caught slightly, emotion making it hard to speak. "Thank you. It's perfect." He immediately stood and placed it on a prominent shelf, where it brought unexpected warmth to the otherwise stark room, like a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds. Over dinner, the conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by genuine laughter and thoughtful pauses. Philip found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, the walls he'd built over years of corporate success crumbling bit by bit. "I'm trying to reconnect with my brother Andrew," he admitted, pushing a perfectly roasted potato around his plate. "Years of putting profit over people. It cost me my family. Andrew always said I'd lost my way, and he was right. I didn't listen then, but I'm listening now." Tessa reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly, her touch conveying understanding without judgment. "But you found your way back. That's what matters. It's never too late to rebuild bridges." "Speaking of finding ways forward," Martin added, setting down his water glass, "Tessa and I have been thinking about additional services for Hope's Haven. The job training programs, therapy services, things that could really help veterans transition successfully into civilian life." Philip's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Actually, I've been researching something similar. What if we created a comprehensive support system, something that addresses all aspects of reintegration?" They spent the next hour bouncing ideas back and forth, their empty plates forgotten as possibilities expanded before them. Philip found himself relaxing into the easy camaraderie, enjoying the genuine connection. When Tessa shared stories about her early days with Hope, he listened intently, no longer the impatient man who'd once dismissed her on that fateful flight, but someone who understood the value of every person's journey. As the evening drew to a close, Philip walked them to the door, feeling oddly reluctant to see them go. Watching them head to their car, arm in arm in the cool evening air, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The photograph of Hope caught his eye as he turned back inside, and he smiled, realizing how much fuller his life had become since learning to let others in. The empty spaces in his home, like those in his heart, were finally beginning to fill with something meaningful. Philip sat on a weathered park bench, watching children play on the swings nearby. His fingers drummed nervously against his knee as he waited for Andrew. The last time they'd met for coffee had been stilted, formal, but at least Andrew had agreed to see him again. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of children's laughter. He spotted his younger brother walking along the path, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. Andrew had their father's steady gait, something Philip had never noticed before. Or maybe he'd just never taken the time to notice. Even from a distance, Philip could see the slight gray at his brother's temples, another detail he'd missed over the years. "Hey," Andrew said, settling onto the bench with careful distance between them. His shoulders were tense, guarded. "Thanks for coming," Philip replied, his voice softer than usual. "I know it's not easy. I appreciate you giving me another chance." They sat in silence for a moment, watching a little girl in a pink coat chase pigeons across the grass. It reminded Philip of their own childhood, when they'd do the same thing in their grandmother's backyard. Those simple days felt like a lifetime ago. "Remember when you used to help me catch frogs at the pond?" Andrew asked unexpectedly, a slight smile playing at his lips. His eyes had that faraway look of someone lost in memories. Philip nodded, grateful for the opening. "Before I became too concerned with keeping my shoes clean. Mom used to get so mad at us tracking mud through the kitchen." "Before a lot of things," Andrew said quietly, the warmth in his voice fading. Philip turned to face his brother. "I was wrong, Andrew. Not just about the business decisions you questioned, but about everything. I convinced myself that success meant more than family, more than doing what's right. I was so focused on climbing higher that I didn't see what I was leaving behind." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Do you know how many times I tried to reach you? How many family dinners you missed because you were closing a deal? I watched Mom's face fall every time you called with another excuse." "I do now," Philip admitted, shame burning in his chest. "Every time you called me out on displacing families or cutting corners, I told myself you were naive, that you didn't understand business. But you understood something more important. You understood humanity. You never lost sight of what really matters." "It wasn't just about the business practices, Phil," Andrew said, using Philip's childhood nickname for the first time in years. "It was watching my brother turn into someone I didn't recognize, like you were vanishing piece by piece." Philip felt the weight of those words in his chest. "I know. I lost myself somewhere along the way. But I'm trying to find my way back. It's not easy facing who I became, but I want to make things right." They talked about the years they'd lost, about Andrew's struggles watching Philip's transformation into someone cold and distant. Philip listened, really listened, as his brother shared his pain and disappointment. Each word was like a stone added to the wall between them, but at least now they were acknowledging it was there. When Andrew mentioned hearing about Hope's Haven, his tone shifted slightly. "That sounds more like the brother I used to know," he said cautiously. There was a hint of hope in his voice that made Philip's heart lift. As they stood to leave, Philip held out his hand. Andrew took it, then pulled him into a brief, awkward hug instead. The gesture, though stiff, meant more than words could express. "Same time next week?" Andrew asked, adjusting his jacket. Philip nodded, relief washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. Sometimes the longest journeys began with the smallest steps. The library buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, filling every available chair and even lining the walls. Philip stood near the back, watching Tessa arrange her notes at the podium, her hands steady despite the crowd. Hope lay calmly at her feet, a steady presence as always, her brown eyes scanning the room with gentle awareness. The room held an electric energy, veterans in crisp uniforms, families with wide-eyed children, and community members of all ages gathered to hear Tessa's story. Martin squeezed his wife's hand tenderly as she rose to speak, pride evident in his expression. Her voice, though quiet at first, grew stronger with each word, filling the hushed space. "There are moments that break us," she began, "and moments that rebuild us, piece by piece." The room fell silent, hanging on her every word, the only sound the soft rustle of clothing as people leaned forward in their seats. Philip noticed a young veteran in the front row nodding along, tears streaming unchecked down his face as Tessa described her darkest moment, a panic attack that had left her paralyzed in the middle of a grocery store, surrounded by bewildered shoppers. She spoke of Hope's gentle intervention, how the dog's steady presence and warm touch had anchored her back to reality when nothing else could reach her. "Hope didn't just save me that day," Tessa read, her voice thick with emotion, one hand absently reaching down to touch her faithful companion's head. "She showed me that healing isn't about being strong all the time. Sometimes it's about letting others help you stand when your own legs can't hold you up." The words hit Philip hard, settling deep in his chest. He thought back to that first confrontation on the plane, how his arrogance and impatience had nearly blinded him to the profound lesson Tessa would teach him about humility and compassion. The memory made him both wince and smile. After the reading, people lined up to share their stories with Tessa, forming a queue that stretched to the library's entrance. An elderly veteran with silver hair hugged her tight, whispering tearful thanks into her ear. A young woman with a service dog of her own spoke about feeling seen and understood for the first time, her German shepherd sitting attentively at her side. Philip watched from the sidelines, content to let Tessa have her moment in the spotlight. But she caught his eye and waved him over, her smile warm and insistent. "This wouldn't have happened without Philip," she announced to the small group around her, her voice carrying clear and strong. "He reminded me that our stories matter, even the parts we're afraid to share, even the chapters we wish we could rewrite." Martin clapped Philip on the shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about how far they'd come from their first tense meeting. Hope wagged her tail, sensing the joy in the room, her whole body wiggling with happiness. As the crowd thinned to just a handful of lingering readers, Tessa pulled out a fresh copy of her book, its cover glossy under the library lights. Her pen moved deliberately across the title page, each word carefully chosen. Philip read her words, his vision blurring slightly. To Philip, who proved that hope isn't just a name, it's a choice we make every day. Thank you for choosing to change. Tessa. He held the book carefully, feeling the weight of both the pages and the moment, running his fingers over the embossed letters on the cover. Tessa's smile was warm and knowing as she handed it to him. "You helped make this possible," she said simply, her eyes bright with gratitude. "No," Philip replied, his voice rough with emotion, shaking his head slightly. "You showed me what was possible. I just finally started paying attention to the lessons that were there all along." The community center's meeting room crackled with tension. Philip sat at the panel table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The moderator, a local councilwoman, opened the floor to comments. One by one, former residents approached the microphone. "Mr. Mercer, your company gave us just 30 days to leave our homes," a gray-haired woman said, her voice trembling. "My grandchildren had to change schools mid-year. We lost our community." Philip nodded solemnly, maintaining eye contact. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Chen. What we did was wrong." A middle-aged man stepped up next. I lost my business when you demolished our block. That shop was my father's legacy." His anger was palpable, fists clenched at his sides. Instead of deflecting, Philip leaned forward into the microphone. "I was blinded by profit margins and ignored the human cost. There's no excuse for what I did to your family's business, Mr. Rodriguez." As more residents shared their stories, Philip listened intently, taking notes. When it was his turn to speak, he stood slowly. "I can't undo the damage I've caused," he began, his voice steady but humble. "But I can work to make things right. Every future project will include affordable housing units. And today, I'm announcing a scholarship fund for families displaced by my past developments." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A young woman raised her hand. "How do we know this isn't just another PR stunt?" "A fair question," Philip replied. "I invite any of you to join our community advisory board. Help us shape these projects. Hold us accountable." Several residents nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Chen spoke up again. "I'd like to be on that board, Mr. Mercer. Someone needs to make sure you keep your word." After the forum, Philip stayed to speak with residents individually. Some turned away, but others stepped forward to share more stories or express interest in the advisory board. As he shook hands with Mr. Rodriguez, the man's grip was firm, but no longer hostile. "Actions speak louder than words," Mr. Rodriguez said. "We'll be watching." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Philip replied, understanding the trust would have to be earned one day at a time. Philip sat at his desk, turning the cream-colored envelope over in his hands. The return address belonged to Sarah Martinez, a name that stirred distant memories. Opening the letter carefully, he began to read. "Dear Mr. Mercer, I attended the community forum last week, but couldn't bring myself to speak. My family lived in the Riverside apartments for 20 years before your company's development forced us out. We lost more than just an apartment. We lost our neighborhood, our friends, our sense of belonging." Philip's throat tightened as he continued reading. "My father was a Vietnam veteran. He struggled with PTSD his whole life, but he always told me that people deserve second chances. He believed that true change comes from acknowledging our mistakes and working to make things right. He passed away last year, but I think he would have been proud to see what you're doing with Hope's Haven." Tears welled in Philip's eyes. He had to pause before continuing. "When I heard about your project for veterans, I was skeptical at first, but watching you at the forum, seeing your genuine remorse and commitment to change, it reminded me of what Dad always said. Your actions won't erase the past, but they're giving hope to people who need it most. Sincerely, Sarah Martinez." Philip read the letter 3 more times, each word hitting harder than before. He reached for his phone, pressing the intercom button. "Evelyn, please schedule a team meeting for tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the next Hope's Haven project." He carefully placed Sarah's letter in a simple silver frame, positioning it prominently on his desk, where he would see it every day. It would serve as both a reminder of his past failures and a symbol of the possibility of redemption. Taking out his personal stationery, Philip began writing his response to Sarah, expressing his gratitude for her forgiveness and sharing his plan to dedicate the next Hope's Haven project to her father's memory. The words flowed easily, carried by genuine emotion and purpose. The framed letter caught the morning light, casting a gentle glow across his desk. Philip touched the frame lightly, acknowledging both the pain of the past and the promise of the future it represented. The autumn sun cast a warm glow over the newly completed Hope's Haven complex. Colorful balloons and patriotic bunting decorated the entrance, where rows of chairs faced a small stage. The excitement was palpable as veterans, families, and local officials gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Philip stood near the podium, adjusting his tie nervously. His eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the smiling faces of those who would soon call this place home. Tessa sat in the front row, with Hope at her feet, while Martin stood chatting with city officials. "You ready?" Tessa asked, approaching Philip with a reassuring smile. Philip nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "More ready than I've ever been." Taking the stage, Philip gripped the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. "A year ago, I was a different person," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I was someone who valued profit over people, someone who couldn't see beyond my own interests. Then I met Tessa and Martin Harding on a delayed flight, and everything changed." He gestured toward them, and a warm round of applause followed. "They showed me what true strength looks like, what dignity means, what it means to serve others instead of yourself." As Philip continued his speech, several audience members wiped away tears. He spoke about the importance of second chances and the power of community. When he finished, Tessa took the stage and shared her own perspective on the project's significance. "Hope's Haven isn't just about housing," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's about healing. It's about showing our veterans that their service matters, that they deserve a place to call home." The actual ribbon cutting was a blur of camera flashes and applause. Philip and Tessa stood together, the giant scissors between them as they made the ceremonial cut. The red ribbon fluttered to the ground as cheers erupted from the crowd. Families began touring their new homes, their voices echoing with excitement through the hallways. Children raced to the playground, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. Philip watched it all, his heart full. During a quiet moment, he stepped up to the microphone again. "I'm proud to announce that we're already planning our second Hope's Haven complex," he said. "It will be dedicated to the memory of James Wilson, a veteran who never got to see this day, but whose daughter helped me understand the importance of redemption." As the ceremony wound down, a small girl in a yellow dress approached Philip. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Tugging gently on his sleeve, she looked up at him with bright eyes. "Thank you for our new house, Mr. Mercer," she said softly. "My mommy says we won't have to move anymore." Philip knelt down to her level, fighting back tears. He couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of her gratitude. This was what it all meant. Not the press coverage or the accolades, but this one small moment of real impact. The child's words echoed in his mind, a reminder that every brick in Hope's Haven represented a promise kept, a life changed, a future secured. For the first time in his life, Philip felt truly, completely fulfilled. The autumn evening was mild as Philip pulled up to the Hardings' cozy suburban home, Grace wagging her tail excitedly in the back seat. The setting sun cast long shadows across the well-maintained lawn, highlighting the cheerful mums blooming in the flower beds. He grabbed the bottle of sparkling cider he'd brought and helped Grace out of the car, her paws clicking softly against the concrete driveway. Tessa opened the door before they reached it, Hope padding along beside her, his service vest neat and tidy. The two dogs immediately touched noses, their tails wagging in synchronized joy, soft whimpers of happiness escaping them both. "Look at these two," Tessa laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "They're already best friends." Martin appeared in the doorway, wearing an apron decorated with faded Italian phrases and holding a wooden spoon that dripped tomato sauce. "The lasagna's almost ready. Come on in, Philip. You're just in time." Inside, the house was warm and inviting, filled with the rich aroma of garlic bread and marinara sauce. Family photos lined the walls, telling the story of the Hardings' journey together. As they settled in the living room, Grace and Hope curled up together on a plush dog bed in the corner, their fur mingling in shades of gold and brown. "The second Hope's Haven is coming along faster than expected," Philip shared, accepting a glass of cider from Martin, the bubbles dancing in the soft lamplight. The contractors say we're ahead of schedule. They think we might finish before winter sets in. Tessa's eyes lit up. That's wonderful. My publisher just told me the memoir has sold over 10,000 copies. The feedback has been incredible. Veterans are reaching out daily to share their stories. Some say it's helped them find the courage to seek help. You've both created such meaningful legacies, Martin observed, settling into his favorite armchair, the leather worn smooth from years of use. It's amazing what can happen when we open ourselves to change. Philip nodded, watching Grace and Hope play wrestling on the floor, their playful growls filling the room with joy. I never thought a delayed flight could change my life so completely. You two showed me what really matters. You did the hard work, Philip, Tessa said warmly, reaching over to squeeze his hand. You chose to listen, to learn, to change. That takes real courage. Over dinner, they shared stories and laughed like old friends, passing steaming plates of lasagna and warm garlic bread across the table. Philip felt a deep sense of belonging he'd never experienced in his previous life of luxury and isolation. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with true friends filled his heart with gratitude. Later, Philip sat alone in the Hardings' garden, Grace's head resting on his lap as crickets chirped their evening song. He unfolded a letter he'd received that morning from a family living in Hope's Haven. The paper was already worn from multiple readings, its creases soft and familiar. Dear Mr. Mercer, it began, we never thought we'd have a place to call home again. Thanks to you and Hope's Haven, our children have their own rooms for the first time. We can finally breathe easier. Our youngest daughter has started smiling again. Looking up at the stars twinkling above in the velvet sky, Philip smiled, gently stroking Grace's soft fur. The peace he felt in that moment was worth more than all his previous successes combined. He finally understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched and the hearts you helped heal. If you enjoyed the story of Tessa, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.